It is against this background that you can understand how and why Islam gradually crossed the Red Sea into Africa, because there were already pre-existing ties and connections through trade and commerce and through travels between people living on the western part of the Red Sea and people living on the eastern part of the Red Sea. Once the Islamic movement became dominant in Arabia and moved forward to occupy areas called Palestine, what we now call Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, and all those areas, Islam gradually moved westward, and this resulted in the conquest of Egypt. Again, here you have to look at the context of Islamic penetration of Egypt. Egyptian civilization of the pharaohs had already waned and disappeared, and the Egyptians were dominated by waves after waves of foreign invaders, going back to the Assyrians, who were able to defeat the Egyptians because they discovered the use of iron. And of course, that changed the warfare in the Middle East and in the region, just like the atomic bomb changed the nature of warfare in world history. So the discovery of iron by the Assyrians turned the table against the Egyptians, and of course, the Egyptians would later recover, just like the Russians would get the atomic bomb later on, after the United States had an advantage briefly. The same thing happened in human history. I mean, the Assyrians, who were able to conquer the Egyptians, destroy the pharaonic culture, and of course they would be replaced as the power play in the Mediterranean and the Middle Eastern part of the world. Change. The Assyrians would be overcome by the Babylonians, and of course the Babylonians will become rulers over Egypt, and of course and Egypt would be a province of Cyrus the Great. And then, of course, later on, the Babylonians themselves will collapse, like all dominant powers in history, and would be replaced by the Greeks, Alexander the Great. And of course, Egypt would be part of the Ptolemies, you see, because once Alexander died, his two generals divided his empire into two. The Seleucids took over Syria and the eastern wing, and then, of course, the Ptolemies took Egypt. I give this historical background because I don't want to convey the impression that when Islam came, there was nothing in Egypt. There was a historical background in Egypt. And by the time the Muslim came, the Greeks had been replaced by the Romans. And of course, the Romans empire would then be taken over by the Christians, because by the time Islam appeared in the horizon, Christianity was already established as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And Christianity was very much embedded in Egyptian society, because some of the early founders of the Christian church came out of Egypt. The very Trinity itself was put forth by an Egyptian who was able to get the general leadership of what was then the Catholic Church before the Reformation. Now, this background is very important in order to understand the coming of Islam in the region, because when the Muslim armies rolled across the Red Sea into Egypt, there was a government which was Roman, but Eastern Roman, called the Byzantines, because once the Roman Empire collapsed, after it was invaded by Attila the Hun, the center of gravity of the Roman Empire moved east. And of course, that's why you have Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul. And of course, the Christian eastern wing of the Roman Empire that were governing the Mediterranean controlled Egypt. That is the background. When Islam entered Egypt, there was a Byzantine dynasty governing Egypt. And of course, the people who were living in Egypt were not very happy with the Byzantine rulers. And historians would say that there was some connivance on the part of the Christians in Egypt with the Arab armies to facilitate the conquest of Egypt. And of course, these Muslim armies were able to conquer Egypt, and of course, the majority of the people will continue to be Christian, and there were some sizable number of Jews in Egypt at that time. And these Christian and Jews who became part of this newly constructed Arab Muslim empire would gradually convert to Islam over time. And of course, this would set the stage for the expansion of Islam across North Africa. Now the Egyptians, you must understand, had their own language, Coptic language, which goes back to Pharaonic Egypt. And of course, the Egyptians were also influenced by the foreign invaders, and they became Greek speakers and Latin speakers. But by the time Islam came, the Greek speakers were dominant because they were the Byzantines, the Eastern wing. So the Arabic language gradually replaced Greek in Alexandria and some of the other areas. And of course, capitals like what we now call Kahira, became new towns that were constructed by the coming of by the Muslims. And then of course, the Muslims will gradually move across North Africa in the establishment of Islamic rule. Now,